So this is the lesson for the catch-up of the session that we missed. A really important session. So what I'm going to go over first is just a few key things to think about when we're dealing with the arms and the legs, and how things like the muscles need to be thought of when we're constructing the shapes, and some subsurface stuff that we've not really spoken about too much and not really looked at too much. We've looked at the shape, but we've not really talked about them in any real detail. And it's just these bits up here that I've got up. Number one, when we're dealing with the arms, now that we're dealing with the chest and the head, the chest and the shoulder, and we're going into the arm now, we have to think about the way that the deltoid muscle, the pectoral muscle, and the biceps and the triceps all kind of connect and fold into each other. And we spoke about this a little bit in class about the order of muscles. Again, coming back to that dominant and subdominant shape language. When we're dealing with the pectoral deltoid bicep area here, the first muscle I would always put in is probably going to be the pectoral, because that's going to be subdominant of the deltoid muscle. So we all know how to put that in. We've been putting that in a fair bit so far. So make sure that I've got that in there. And then I'll pretty much choose in between putting either the deltoid or the tricep in there. Generally, I'd go with the deltoid, because if we think about radiating our detail from the center of the body outwards, so we're not going in detailing like the elbow and then going in, we detail, or we add detail from the middle outwards. The pectoral will come first, then the deltoid, and then the arm. All the pieces of the arms. So when I'm dealing with this, again, I'm keeping my shapes simple at first. I'm roughing them in, but I'm thinking about the shapes. Obviously, we were talking about the pectoral being almost like a fan shape. It's curled from underneath in the shoulder, and it radiates outwards. You can see in this diagram here that you can see that fold kind of radiates out, like it's kind of concertinaed like a fan. Now in the shoulder, we've got the anterior, posterior, and exterior deltoid. We don't need to know about which one's which. All we really need to know about, if we're going for serious muscle definition, is the fact that we've got a muscle, one of the deltoid muscles at the front. It's like a chicken breast kind of shape. One that's on the top, which is the one that kind of folds into, you can see here, into the deltoid, into the tricep and bicep area. And basically a mirror of what's going on at the front, which would technically be the posterior. So we've got three muscles, one at the front in this image where it says deltoid, and then basically the same chicken breast-esque shape on the shoulder at the top, in the middle, and then basically the same at the back. Now that's really only important if we're going for serious muscle definition, or we really want to make someone look like really, really strong and intense, or make someone look really wiry. But this kind of stuff, like the separation between these, you'll never really see in the day-to-day person, but it is good to know about. The shape I really want us to think about is more about, if we just kind of like look at this red shape as a kind of a basic silhouette, we just want this kind of like squat teardrop shape. If we had our arms up in a T-pose, it'd be much more like a teardrop shape, but we want this shape to be quite graphically defined at first. So we've got the point at the top of the shoulder where it bends into the trapezius muscle at the top. We've got the point at the bottom where it kind of blends into the bicep and the tricep. And obviously at the front, we really do want that nice separation. We want to make sure that the line is nice and defined between the pectoral and the deltoid, at least in the initial sculpts. Again, depending on your subject, depending on the style, depending on the physical aspects of this character, they might be different. But generally, you want to make sure that we can define that muscle. Now at the back, we're going to look at that muscle at the back in a little bit, because it kind of works with the scapula as well. But how it connects to the back in the trapezius muscle and interacts with that area, it's a little bit different, but we're going to look at that later on. Okay. So along with this, we've also got to start thinking about the abductor and reductor, the abduction muscles at the front are basically pushing and pulling the muscles, and how that might kind of change the shape of our subject. And also what's going on in the back of the shoulder with the scapula. So just thinking about this one first. So if we think about how our muscles work with our pectorals going into our deltoids, with the breastbone at the front, your solar plexus, and your clavicle and stuff, you've really got to think about how the muscles are being compressed and stretched. Obviously, if we're bringing our shoulders back, we're going to be stretching those pectorals and bringing them closer to the surface. So if you've got quite a lot of mass in that area, maybe it's like fat or muscle, you're going to be pulling and squashing those to the chest. So as you're, if you're doing a pose, which is going to be a bit of spoiler, so the whole mug that's going to be coming up is going to be posed sculpt sketches to try and control those anatomical forms. Because we've just been doing A pose at the minute, T pose. But it'd be good to try and get some experience doing some more kind of posed work, or making some of the T pose, posing it, and then fixing what we need to fix. But we can see there on the left-hand side, if we're pulling our shoulders back, our pectorals are being stretched. Obviously, they're being supplanted in the middle, our solar plexus, and they're being pulled outwards. So we're going to get much more elongated muscle fibers. We're really we're stretching this the connection between the pectoral and the deltoid open. And then if we bring them in, obviously we're pushing everything into the middle. So obviously, if you're carrying a lot of weight there with breast tissue, fat tissue, muscle tissue, whatever, that's all going to be crushed in together. And the muscle are the feature. Let's call it just pectoral. Is going to get fatter. It's going to get plumper because obviously we're compressing all that mass into one place. So this is just good to think about, because it also is good to think about when we're just posing. Generally we're closer to this pose on the left, which means when we're relaxed and we're just standing up as normal. When we're sculpting in T pose, we're not squashing or stretching our muscles, but we're definitely more towards this abduction on the left, or pulling back. So you've got to think about, you can kind of see in this shadow line, this image where we've got this little shadow appearing here. This is what I was talking about the connection point between the deltoid and the pectoral. So essentially that's where the deltoid is up here, where the blue line, the blue arrow is. And you can see the separation between those two. Now what's also happening at the back is they've got the scapula. Now the scapula is a very interesting little bone, because it's not necessarily a static bone. I believe the term is floating bone, whereas like most of our bones are connected and are very, very static, and they stay where they are. Obviously, the skull is a very static object. The ribs won't move in any great fashion. They kind of like bend and stretch to compensate. But the scapula, this is also going to be going into when we're thinking about posing. The scapula moves around the body. So you can see if we're looking from the top, so these two kind of go together. When we're looking from the top and we've got an image on the left where it's arm up but relaxed, the shoulders in the normal position, that's where the scapula will be at the back. It'll be in normal position. Now, those of you who don't know what the scapula is, it's this, you can feel it if you poke around either your own back or someone else's back, around where the shoulder joints on the back. You'll be able to feel this muscle, especially when you roll it around. But as you pull your shoulder forward, you push the shoulder forward. Again, this will be when we're adduction on the right here. The scapula will be pulling round the body. It's not going to be pulling outwards or forwards. It's literally going to be tracing around the ribs. Again, this is why it's incredibly important to understand what's going on with things like the rib cage, the skeletal structure, this dominant feature which is controlling the majority of the shape. Now, where we can also think about this is, yes, using it when we're doing pose sketching or pose sculpts to make sure that if we are doing something where we're pulling that shoulder forward, that we're making that look, we're thinking about that position and thinking how this is then going to interact with like the deltoid, the triceps, and also just the fat deposits in this area. But also some character design stuff. Say you're doing a character which has 4 arms, like Goro from like Mortal Kombat or something, but your second set of arms has to be a little bit more forward of the body to kind of make sense and fit in. Maybe we have a little bit of that scapular kind of information down there, kind of makes it feel a little bit more believable. Maybe a character has arms that are far forward. If you're doing some sort of creature design, maybe your arms are a bit more far forward. So again, you'd think about having this kind of scapular information in that kind of area. It's very, very important to know about how the scapula interacts with the surface here. So this top one here, you can really see that shape right there. It's kind of like a bit of a triangle. This shadow line here is basically the back of the scapula, pushing up against the surface. Obviously, muscles aren't like waterlogged round things. muscles generally are very, very flat. They're like sheets of meat, essentially. So when they're being pulled around a surface, if you pay attention to a lot of these images, you're going to see, there's a shadow line, but it gets deeper or shallower in some areas. That's because of muscles. You can see here, we can clearly see how the lat muscles are creating this kind of shallower line here, right across this, running from underneath the armpit down across there. We can see those inferior, the major, minor, and the sacrospinatus, whatever that one does. They're kind of poking out a little bit here, just behind the scapula here. That's those three groups of muscles, which I can never say one of them because it's hard for some reason. And then you've got the trapezius muscle, which is kind of blended into the back of the neck. So really, really important stuff to know about. Also really important when we're just doing our general sculpts to think about how that is going to be affecting the surface. Especially if you're doing a thinner person or more athletic person whose the body fat is lesser, they got a lower percentage of body fat, you're going to have more of a pronounced scapula. It's also good to think about when we're doing posing. If you're doing someone who's making this kind of pose, they're engaging these scapulas. So they're going to be, that's what's giving this kind of shape on the right-hand side of this image, right here. We've got this bulge. You can kind of follow the line up from his back. And then you can almost follow a shadow line going into it. This bulge here is scapula. It's poking out because he's engaging it. They're getting pulled around the thorax, around the rib cage. And in that case, what they're doing is actually pushing outwards to become almost acting like wings pushing outwards on the side. Something to really think about. Number one is just think about the order of sculpting in the muscles, because we're dealing generally with radiating out the detail. The detail starts, let's say, in the body from the thorax. In the solar plexus, which is the middle of the rib cage, we'll sculpt in the pectoral, then we'll sculpt in the deltoid. And we go in that order, and just making sure that we have that separation between the deltoid and the pectoral. You can kind of see it here as well. And then the scapula. It's probably like one of the most important bones of the upper body, after all the rest of the main, in this case, the grey bones. This bone here is very, very important. So something to just be like super, super aware of, because this all feeds into arms and legs and stuff. Now, what I'm going to do first is just talk about arms. And I've got a little model here. This is one of the basic models off of ZBrush anyway, so this guy is around to look at. But he's pretty good for this. So I've got a few different ways of thinking, a few different examples. Again, this is all from the Anatomy for Sculptors ArtStation. And we're just thinking about that color coding. And also, like I've been saying about thinking about the details and the muscles radiating out of the center of the body, down, away from the body. If we think like that, again, when we're coming to do our arms and legs, we think about radiating out from the middle. We start from the chest, radiate into the shoulder, then into biceps, then into forearm, then into hand. And for the legs, you radiate from the pelvis into the upper leg, into the thigh, then into the shin and quads, and then into the ankle, and then into the foot. But this image here is really, really, I really want us to pay attention to this kind of image here. Because again, breaking stuff down really simply and color coding stuff. Think about that color coding, think about those as separate design or sculpting elements. So we have that deltoid muscle. And yes, it is three muscles, essentially, but we can think about it as one shape. And I think I said in class, I almost think about this as a cap for the shoulder. Because it is almost like someone's put like a bit of like an old cap on your shoulder, and it's like a big circle shape. But this image is also very kind of cool for three, but one. Very, very cool things it points out. And that's something that I call pinning. And it's points where you'll have muscles converging, or points where you'll have bones sticking out. So for instance, for the clavicle, pinning would be in the collarbone here, and then in the top of the collarbone there, and the shoulder. For this guy's obviously got very, very bony shoulders. So it's a great example, because this pinning is where your bones are going to be exposing, or in this case, it's where muscles kind of intersect. So this is a really, really nice point here where you've got your deltoid muscle running into your bicep and your tricep. Your bicep is at the front because there are two muscles which technically make up the bicep, and the tricep is at the back. There's technically 3 muscles which make up the tricep. So when I'm doing the shoulder, just starting off with a cylinder, and I'm just thinking about, right, making a mass for the shoulder out of my main sculpt, out of my shoulders, or even I can bring in a sphere or something to make that mass for the shoulder. And then I'll probably bring in a cylinder just for the arm itself. And I'm thinking about, right, making that cap for the shoulder, making sure that deltoid is wrapping around. It almost looks like it's enveloping top of my arm. And then I'm finding that little pinch point, that pin. And then in front of that, just below it and in front, I've got my bicep, which essentially, like, the very easy way of thinking about this, without going into like crazy anatomical stuff, is essentially from your armpit down to your elbow, and it's just a little bit of a lump. I mean, this image in the middle here is a great example of just how to think about it. It's nothing too kind of crazy within the shape. Obviously, you're looking at your different reference, especially from our reference, Laura's going to be different. People like Saskia, their biceps and triceps aren't necessarily well defined, but people like Anthony, very well defined. Yanni, not as defined, but a little more defined. His is more like a chunky muscle, rather than Anthony, who's much more of a worked muscle, like a defined muscle. Well, Laura, hers are going to be more prominent because she's very, very thin, but she's also looks like she's quite athletic or wiry. So then what we're seeing is pretty much the absence of any body fat, or much body fat, and we're seeing the sheet of muscle which is making up that section. So what I'm thinking here at the front is just this muscle, and I'm just thinking about that mass. If you imagine just like tensing your, tensing your muscles in your arm, making a bit of like a pump, and just kind of flexing a little bit. That's the muscle which appears, and then at the back, you basically got the same thing. However, if you want to go into it a little bit more, you have technically got, again, the 3 muscles. You've got 2 muscles at the top, and then one muscle in the bottom, which kind of pins to the elbow. Funnily enough, it's very, very weird when you first kind of realize this, but the muscles that are in the arm here are pretty much exactly the same, kind of, that are in the leg at the bottom. Again, those cycler muscles. But that's just cool stuff that you sometimes notice. But yeah, with the muscle at the back, you can approach it the same way you approach the muscle at the front. It's basically a little bit of a directional bulge. So instead of just being like a round, so like when we used to draw characters when we were younger, we just drew like a circle for muscles. It's not necessarily that. It's more like a pulled bulge, a bean shape underneath the arm. Again, this is how my brain kind of, like, my synesthesia kind of works it out. Now the back, basically the same thing. It's just there's a little bit more of a definition up here in the top of the arm, or I guess in the middle of the tricep. But generally, unless you're like super, super buff or you do a lot of working out, this muscle is going to be very subtle, So just being aware that we have the 2 muscles at the top, which again join into the back of the shoulder underneath the deltoid, which I'll get an image for that up in a bit, back into the deltoid. And they basically come down, and they basically fold underneath what's coming on the forearm. But then you've got this muscle which attaches to the elbow that comes out from underneath these 2 muscles down. But you can see here, so they've got a nice little color-coded, a purple dot, essentially, is where you've got the conversion of muscles. The red dot is where we've got bones poking through. So at this point, on the elbow, this is where we've got the elbow sticking out. And there are fat deposits around here. This is obviously just showing us the muscle groups. It's not thinking about fat deposits. It's not thinking about whatever. It's just thinking about muscles. So right there, we've got a nice bony protrudence for the elbow. Now to the forearm, this is where it can get a little bit more kind of difficult and very, very interesting when you come to posing people, posing creatures, or kind of adding this really nice sinewy detail. There are generally 3 muscles in the forearm, and for the life of me, I can never remember what they're called. But essentially, you've got this purple one here, which is attaching to the thumb, and it comes from the outside of the elbow, round. And again, this is a little bit of a callback to what's happening in the forearm here, and also kind of what's happening in the leg. We've got one muscle here which comes from the outside, pinning to the inside of the thumb. Now, if you're thin enough or athletic enough, you'd be able to, if you flex your hand or your forearm, you'd be able to see around where the middle of the thumb is, about here, where you've got a bit of a dip. And this is, again, another one of these pinpoints where you've got a muscle pin right there, because there are loads of muscles in the hand, but right here, you've got your long tendon there. And then you've got a tendon there. You've got another muscle on the inside, which is the biggest of the three, I believe. And again, if you're athletic or thin enough, you'll be able to see this. That basically goes up and it just traces it inside your elbow. You got a little soft spot, that little sensitive soft spot in the middle of your elbow. Essentially, if you were to sharpen yourself, you'd be able to kind of like trace out those shapes. So if it's in the middle of your elbow here. And the other very, very cool muscle to think about is this one here, which is a combination, this shape in general, this lighter blue shape here, is a combination of muscles, but it's also a combination of the bone, which is in there. And again, I can't remember this bone, because your forearm is broken up into two bones, just like your shin is broken up into two bones. And they kind of like bend and concertina around each other. And that basically connects from your elbow down to your ankle. Your ankle? Your wrist. And you don't generally see this being used, this shape being used too much when you get like bigger characters or even characters who are very, very, very muscly. But this is really good to show strength or to show wiriness or to show like it's really nice shape. When you have this, you have someone posed and they're engaging their arm where it's kind of like in like what's happening on the right here. It's engaged where it's rotating into itself. You're pulling this bone and this muscle group around. And what happens is you start to engage both the interior and exterior muscle groups, these purple and green ones, and you get this really nice like separation between here. I mean, you can kind of see it in this image on here, where you've got the little gap in between the bone. So this is where the purple muscle would be, right here. Then you get this little indentation, and then this it disappears off the page a little bit. But we're going to look at examples of this anyway. Disappears off there, but you can see that shape forming. And generally, those are the main massive we need to think about. Again, you can go very, very granular with this. You can go into anterior, posterior, exterior muscle groups, and even down to submuscle groups and all that kind of jazz. And you can go on for hours. We just need to worry about these 6 muscles: deltoid, bicep, tricep, and then I will learn these one day. The exterior, it's called just the exterior forearm muscle, the interior forearm muscle, and then this interstitial muscle bone group here, which is cool. Oh, there is also annoyingly one other muscle inside the forearm, which I generally keep as part of my bicep. It's a brachialis. There's this dude here. So you can see where the anterior, posterior, and exterior deltoids come. So this is that pinpoint there. You can see these kind of like chicken breast kind of shapes as they make. You can see where the tricep bends around, goes underneath, and this will be attaching to the opposite side of where the bicep will be attaching onto the skeleton. But the brachialis kind of sits in between them. And again, is only one of these muscles you only really see prominently on very, very athletic people. But it essentially makes up the front of the bicep, helps make up that. So cool. So those are the muscle groups I wanted to think about. And again, thinking very graphically, thinking of shapes and thinking about the silhouettes more than anything before we start thinking about the very, very minute details. But there is one way, and I saw this years ago, and it's been hashed over and over again, of how these muscles intersect. Again, we got dominant and subdominant, and then we got order of develop, like order of sculpting essentially. But with things like this, it's really good to think of it like this, like a chain. So instead of your arms, I mean, you see a lot where people don't necessarily think about how the muscles are forming around the bones and how they're intersected with each other. And their arms become either super lumpy because there's no real direction or definition, or their arms become just a bit of a mess. There's no real idea about how the muscles are moving around the surface. But this helped me immensely when I first saw it years ago. And it makes complete sense. If you think about that top deltoid as this top red chain here, then yeah, it literally does just hang off the top of the, you imagine like the shoulder blade and the clavicle wrapping around here. It literally does hang around. The biceps and triceps, they're now switching the opposite direction. They're pointing forwards and backwards. And then you come into the forearm, that's then pointing left and right. And then into the hand, that's pointing forwards. Or you can think about the broadest section of that part of the body is, again, so the broadest part of the deltoid is facing forward, broadest part of the bicep is facing outwards, facing forwards, facing outwards. This really, really helped me. And I've seen people in the past use spheres and just modify the shape. Before you start doing any real detailing, they'll bring in spheres and they'll just squash them down a little bit and make these general, not obviously with the holes in the middle, but they generally make these disc shapes and then lay the forms in. And this is when people are trying to beginning to learn their whole the minutiae of anatomy. But this is really, really good to think about to help the flow of the body. So, however you want to kind of think, I think of this as like up, over, when I think about the arms. Up, over the deltoid, over the, up the deltoid, over the bicep, up the tricep, over the hand. And that has really, really helped me. Really, really helped me. So before we go into anything else, let's just actually have a look at that in play. So we've got our dude here. And I'll just isolate off his arm, like that. So we can see, even to a basic level here, we can see that information at work. And it's not incredibly defined. You know, we've not got super, super crazy detail, but we're still absolutely understanding what we're looking at, because if we keep orbiting around, we can see those defining shapes. We can see those areas where we're actually taking control of some of the shapes. We're sharpening some bits off. We're making sure that we, use the trim dynamic or using the dam standard. We're actually slicing some of this information out. We've got right here, even though this isn't absolutely perfectly anatomically correct, we can still see pectoral wrapping in underneath the deltoid, going into the arm. And then we've got the deltoid on top. Obviously, there's no real definition between anterior, exterior, and posterior, but we've still got a definite deltoid shape right there. Around the back, we can see that we've not got a whole lot of definition here, but we can still see that there is that cap to the shoulder right there. Then we go into the bicep muscle. So again, we've got that little chain example here. We've got just a well thought out, but a pretty simple bulge for the bicep that is then retreating into the crook of the elbow and retreating into underneath the deltoid right there. So we've got a nice little separation underneath here. And around the back, we've got a little bit of a defined muscle group. If we change to something like that, we've got a little bit of a defined muscle group now. We've got this little line here. Oops. I got my pen. We've got a little bit of a muscle group right here, which is just helping us separate between the tricep at the back here and the bicep. Now, there is that bronchialis or brachialis muscle right here on this example. But you can see it's not super, super defined. All we're thinking about here is we're looking at the way the light transitions over the surface. We can see that tricep there. And now all that converges into a pinpoint. Oh, so we got pinpoint, obviously there, where you got the deltoid muscles wrapping around. And then we've got these muscles here. And I might actually just go straight in with something like dam standard and actually just chisel this out at first. Just chisel all the information I need out of it. Like that. And then we're going into the forearm. So we've got that exterior muscle there. Again, coming to that point just inside the thumb. I'll wrap over. Then we've got that lovely muscle there, which attaches to the elbow. And then we've got the interior one. So those are the main muscles I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the arm. And obviously there's a lot of space here. You know, we're missing some stuff. We're missing all the minor muscles that will fill in areas like here and areas like here. And all the, like the wrap, I think it was Umar was asking me about the little wrap, which you always see. There's a little wrap of tenders which wraps around the wrist, all that kind of jazz. You know, but really all I'm worried about is defining these muscles first. And like I said, you can go in there with the damn standard and clay buildup and just kind of like smash them in, sketch them in, and then just work on your forms using like the inflate tool or move brush, or even like the trim dynamic and just almost like Asaro them out a little bit. But this is what I'm looking for at first. Just these big old shapes. And then I'm just thinking about those pinpoints. So pinpoint there in the shoulder, right there. And then I've got that nice pinpoint on the elbow, or in this case, it'd be a bone point. And then the bone point on the wrist there. So we've got the elbow and the wrist poking out. And then we've also got at the top of the deltoid, well, the bottom of the deltoid, top of the bicep, tricep, got the muscle there. And there are other ones as well, like so in the little pinpoint in the crook of the elbow. There's some stuff in there. And also just inside the wrist there. Just like that. And if I did want to define the anterior and posterior deltoid a bit, then all I've got to do is kind of, you know, get some of those damn standard moves going. Ooh, that's very powerful. There you go. Then I can just like a nice light damn standard brush. So yeah, add an in, push back, add it in, push back. Now there will also be a pinpoint up here for how the deltoid attaches to the shoulder. So keep an eye on that again. Look at your reference. But even just defining little bits like that, just a bit of damn standard, knock it back a little bit. That's enough for us to get a bit more of that information if we did want to add a little bit more definition. And as you can see here, just from the example that I'm using, you don't need a massive amount of detail or surface to make those details actually pop out. You just need enough surface to have a damn standard, because what we really on here, we're on nothing. We're absolutely on nothing. It's 500,000 and enough surface for me there. So if I was to do this on a fresh piece, okay, so I've got my body, and I'm going to be moving on, putting an arm into it. So however I want to go about with this arm, it's up to me. Obviously, I could mask off an area and then pull it out to make a mass, or I could bring in a cylinder. Now, one thing I'll probably advise in this is to do this as a separate object. Just like when we did the body separate to the head and then blended that in when we're done. Same jazz with this. And in fact, it's a little bit more important with this, with legs and arms, because there are areas inside the body that we're going to want to have access to for a while, and that's like under the arm, or when it comes to legs, like in between the legs, the interior of the thigh and stuff. We need to make sure that we've got access to that for as long as possible, and that we're not sculpting our arms by our sides. We're sculpting our arms in an A pose, which is where your arms are slightly outwards, or in T pose, which your arms are completely outwards in a straight line. I sculpt in A pose, which is where your arms are slightly outwards. A little more relaxed. It means I'm not trying to sculpt If you stand in a T-pose, you're actually activating your shoulders. You're sculpting with stressed muscles already. It doesn't end looking any good. So bringing in a cylinder, dead simple. So I don't need to explain how to do this. Cylinder, push. And also, it's a little bit small. In fact, yeah, fine. So I'm going to bring this in, and I'm going to make the forearm first. Before I make the bicep. So this is the bicep before I make the forearm. So let's bring it in. Now I would always advise making this a little bit bigger than your arm generally is. I've always found the same. I've always preferred to do this. Just bring it in. Just extend it a little bit. It doesn't matter if you overextend it and make it a bit too long. Obviously, you can just chop that off. A good way to think about the length of your arms and stuff is from shoulder, if you kind of arms by side, from shoulder to elbow, your elbow will be essentially in the middle of your ribs. So your elbow would be like, oops, daisy. Your elbow will be here. And your wrist and hand generally around your groin area. Generally. Okay. So I'm pretty happy with that. Yep, I'm happy with that. And I'm just going to make sure I mirror and weld that over. So I'm working on 2 pieces. There we go. Now, just jumping in with the Dynamesh. So I'm going to match the same resolution as I've got here for my body. So I've got, my body is 144 or 484. Should say. So if we Dynamesh now, this should be really low res. Yeah. So 448. 448. So there we go. So going in there slightly above what I normally would do, but just for the sake of doing this, you can go in low res at first and then build like this. But if I'm going to be blending this into my body fairly soon, it's good to, I find it quite nice to work in the same resolution. But notice my body isn't that high resolution, so inside the whole process, I'll make sure that I'm doing this kind of stuff quite early on. Okay, so now that they're out there, I've got a nice little angle there, so when I'm sculpting, I've still got access to underneath the arms. Okay, and all I'm going to do is, just like with everything else, I'm just going to first just do some big old movement tool stuff and just get that information. The information that I can adjust right from the beginning, get that working. So I've got my reference off to the side of the screen as well, so it's not in the way. So get my pinpoint for my deltoid in there. Try and get as good as I can with a move brush, my deltoid shape. Like this. So thinking about how it's going to be coming in from the pectoral to this side, get my pinpoint like that. And maybe even, if I wanted to, get some anterior, posterior kind of information there, whatever. Switching to my arm now, what I'm going to do is just define some of those muscles. So get my bicep in there, literally just using the damn standard just to chisel that in. I got my brachialis right there. And I got my, essentially everything else that's left is my tricep. But remember as well, we've got the 2 muscles at the top, and then we've got muscle at the bottom. So what I can do is just help define that. Now this will be going into the elbow. So I've got to make sure as I'm adding in these back 2 muscles and defining this shape that if I was to draw down a straight line, that it will connect to what will be an elbow down here. So all I've done there is just use the damn standard just to chisel some stuff in. Oops, I've not got symmetry turned on. So if I was just to go mirror and weld now, we'd lose all that information, because it's totally my mistake. I brought in this new tool and it's not got symmetry turned on. And because I was working on the right arm, my right, their left, it's not done it on the left-hand side. So what I'm going to have to do is go to deformation, mirror, so my detail is now on the left-hand side, our left, their right, and then mirror and weld. Boop, there you go. So always remember, still a mistake by me there, always remember to get your symmetry turned on. Now, like I say, all I've done there is just added a little bit of detail, just with the damn standard, but already it kind of looks okay. Now from here, I don't want to obviously make the entire arm because a lot of the information is not there. Like my forearms are there, my hand's not there. But at this stage, what I can do is just using the move tool or maybe even the inflate tool, I can just, so what I'm actually going to do here as well is hold the Alt tool, the Alt key. So if I hold Alt by using the move brush, instead of just pulling, like normally it pulls camera direction, like that, if I hold Alt, it moves in the normal direction, which is whatever the polygons are facing. So what I can do is grab the front of the elbow here and just start pushing that in a little bit. Pull the back of the triceps out a little bit. Pull the front of the bicep out a little bit. Maybe even pull the bottom of the bicep out a little bit. Push in this bit a little bit. So you can see already with a little bit of nudging, it makes a little bit more sense again. Very cool. Now, I've not thought about trying to kind of merge it to the body yet because I'm not bothered. So what I'm going to do is do the same thing with the forearm and bring in a separate subtool. Again, you can do this all in one. You can bring in one big solid cylinder and do the entire arm in one go. I'm going to do this with separate subtools because why not? So bring in that. And all I'm going to do for this is just make sure I'm matching up scale. Even if I get it off a little bit, it's simple kind of just modeling to fix. I'm not going to do too much. So get my elbow position and then elongate a little bit. Now I'm kind of eyeballing this as well. I'm not going to get this perfect at first, but what I'm doing here is I'm trying to think about how long the whole arm would be if I'm then adding the 6 to 7 to 8 inches of hand that comes after it. Because what's going to happen is if you just do the arm and you're not paying attention, there's every chance that you'll end up sculpting the arm the entire length of the hand, entire length of the arm plus the hand. And then when you put a hand on it, your arms look really, really long. It's the same thing that when we were doing the rib cage, people were making the ribs really wide because they're kind of already imagining the torso with the shoulders attached. And then when you put the shoulders on, when you sculpt the shoulders in, you're adding like too much width to the body at that point. So I'm just making sure that I'm thinking about the hands being there later on, and I'm not making them too long. But it's always it's an easy fix to do if I do end up messing up, which is perfectly viable. So then, both like that. Actually, before I do that, what I'm going to do is instead of having my arm perfectly tilted, I am just going to rotate my forearm. So I'm going to get this in like a little bit of an elbow position. So holding Alt, remember I can move my pivot point around. I'm going to get the elbow, and I'm just going to make sure that it's also rotated in the right kind of axle. It's it's rotating correctly. And I'm just going to rotate this forward a little bit to get a bit of a bend in the arm. You'll see this a lot in models that come from, like, if you on ArtStation, you'll see kind of sculpts coming out for studios. You often see the characters have their arms kind of pointing forward a little bit, and there's like a little bit of bend in them. We want to kind of make our arms a little bit more relaxed. Okay. So now I can do the duplicate. There we go. Make sure I've got symmetry turned on. There we go. Put my Dynamesh to 448. Nope. 8. Enter and Dynamesh. So boom, we're going right in there with the same resolution for everything. This will also make it a lot easier when we come to merge everything together later on. Now I am kind of getting a feeling like these are a little bit too short. So what I'm going to do is just with my move tool, do that trick I was just doing with the Alt tool. And now this is a flat cap at the end. What I'm going to do is just make sure my move tool's over there, hold Alt. I'm just going to pull this forward a little bit to elongate this a little bit. Again, I might end up taking chunks off this anyway. Cool, so with this, first of all, what I'm actually going to do is just take down the width near the wrist. Because if we just bring our reference black chart, there you go. So graphically, how I kind of think about this is your deltoid, and then it goes thinner, then it's bicep, then it goes thinner, then it's your tricep, then it's your forearm, then it goes thinner. So you can see where we've got these little pivot points. Let me get a brighter material. There we go. So you can see where we've got these little pin pivot points. We've got shoulder, thin, bicep, and then where our elbow is, we're going to have it thinner. And then it's forearm, and then it's thinner. So I'm just going to thin this down a little bit at the front, just a little bit. So I'm just using the shift tool for that, the smooth tool. Cool. Get my reference off screen a sec. Now what I'm going to do is do the same thing. Get my damn standard, look at my reference, think about, brings back for a sec. Think about those muscles. So I'm actually going to bring this one. This one helps me the most. I'll do that. There we go. So think about these muscles in the arm. And think about that pinpoint where the elbow is and the muscles that crease and wrap over each other. And I get that kind of stuff in there. So if I roughly sculpt in an elbow, so I'm going to be a bit more kind of hard with this. I'm going to roughly sculpt in an elbow. Again, keeping in line with what's going on here. Right, that's a bad material for this. Let's bring in a good high contrast material. There we go. So I'm going to sculpt in an elbow position. That's my pivot point is. Again, I've not done much. I've just added a little bit of shape there. I'm just going to think about where that wrist is going to be. And just define the line. That has to be very, very. Oops. Define that line in there. And I've just got the two muscles at the front. So again, I'm thinking I'm going to have my hand, or my thumb will be about here, so I can bring in that point there. Bringing this round to there. It's very basic, and it can get a little messy at first, because again, just like with any kind of sculpting we've done so far, at first we just want to define these shapes to then fix them up later on. So what I've done here is I've got my elbow position, I've got my pin position, which is going to be on my wrist. Remember, if your hands out, you're in T pose and you're putting your hands forward, your wrist, the bone of your wrist is going to be at the bottom, and your thumb is going to be at the top. So I want this going to the bottom part there. Now from here, I'm just going to use the move tool again, and maybe a little bit of that inflate. In fact, yeah, I'm going to use the inflate to do a lot of this, because inflate obviously inflates, but if you hold Alt, it deflates. And what I can use this for is just at a low sensitivity, I can just deflate around the wrist, inflate around biceps, triceps, deflate around there, trying to kind of emphasize these muscles. If they build up. And I'm thinking about that chain as well. So this would be the point where the chain's going outwards. So look from the front. There we go. Your chain's going to be going outwards around like this. So we're looking at the flat part. There you go. Get that with a bit of smooth. Split it off a little bit. Maybe just push this back a little bit. And all I'm doing here is just looking at reference. And I'm just trying to match the same shapes, carrying on these shapes as well. So obviously, around the back, we've got around the back, we've got the muscle on the triceps. We've got this one muscle here, right there, which is obviously going into the elbow. And obviously want to kind of continue that down. Now at this point, I feel that I can actually blend these two together. And I'll leave it how it is. Obviously, there's some gaps, but that's fine because, as I've said in some stuff as well, sometimes when you blend these two things together, you might have some artifacting left behind, which actually is quite nice. It actually helps you. Now, I've got these two recesses, these cavities, either side of my elbow. So I'm thinking that actually might help me just in the long run get some nice sharp defined elbow, if that is actually what my character will have. So just having another quick look through, so you can see there that some basic shapes are there. We've got some definition there. Not so much that we've got loads of sharp definition, because we can only get so much with this resolution, but we just merge that down. And then zebra sat that together. You can see there, boom. In fact, I'm going to Dynamesh these at a slightly higher res of 500. Slightly higher, yeah, there we go. So now what I can do is just get some, again, just looking at that reference. Obviously, I'm not going to have holes like this in my elbow, but I'm going to have some defined points at the side of your elbow. Obviously, if you're dealing with a much larger person, either muscle or fat, you're going to have basically the elbow bump thing that's going on where you've got folds of fat and skin overlapping. But if you've got someone who's quite well toned or in good shape, then you'll have these little recesses. So I'm going to try and make sure I leave those behind. Over-define some bits, under-define some bits. So here's one bits I will try and over-define slightly. It's actually the thinner part of the wrist there. So you can see what I did there with the inflate tool, just holding Alt. And it just shrinks it in a tiny bit. I'm not doing much, but it's just enough. And I'm quite happy with that. So maybe just thin out a few bits. Remembering that, you know, if I look back at some of these references or my anatomical reference I'm using, obviously I've got some muscles which are going to be blending down in between some, like here, like that. But at this point, I think I'm good to actually start to blend these in with the main body. So let me merge down that main body onto this. Now remember, I did change my resolution for my Dynamesh, so I am going to go in and do that. So I'm going to change this. I'm going to go even higher. Let's go for 600. Let's go for a bit more detail. There we go. Is that really? Oh no, let's go 800 for this. Yeah, so that's a little bit sharper. Now, obviously, we've just Dynamesh that in, so we've got some sharper details here. So I'm going to knock these back, but I'm going to try and maintain some sharp divide between here. So I'm not going to go super 100% on my smooth. So while holding shift, I'm going to bring my sensitivity down to about 20. So I'm gradually nudging it back and controlling that smoothness. Now, of course, you might have some little craggy, spiky bits like we've got there in the armpit there, but that's fine. And then from here, it's just about defining. So again, looking at your reference, really paying attention. We did a trick when we were doing faces, making something black and white and then adjusting the contrast. You know, taking some of our reference images into Photoshop, making them black and white, upping the contrast is really, really helpful for seeing this kind of information, seeing where you've got the overhangs, the creases, the things that with like a standard flash bulb that you have in like standard cameras or that you have on like a celebrity red carpets and stuff, you don't actually see that much of because the flash bulb will kind of like make all the shadows very, very soft. You want sharp shadows. You want to be able to see all that really nice detail. But you can see like not a whole lot needs doing for this. A lot of it is just making sure that we're paying attention to the shapes. And a big one for arms and legs in general is just making sure we're not giving them superhero muscles if that isn't what is needed. Like I'm trying to avoid having like super massive pecs and stuff. And anything I add, make sure I'm not making it too bulgy. You can see there where I had the brachialis. It's made like a bit of a weird bumpy shape there, so let's make sure I even that out. So that's getting used to always rotating around. So really controlling any lumpy information that we might have occurring. Now, what I'm also going to be thinking about is how they're connecting to the deltoid of the arm. So again, not over defining stuff, but making sure I'm just getting some nice suggestions of how the muscles are attaching to the body. Again, if we're just going for standard person on the street, you're not generally going to have that information super visible. It's very, very soft, this information. Nice up that a little bit. There you go. So some of mine is getting a little bit lumpy. So I'm just going to try and control that a bit with a healthy amount of smooth, and then go in there with like some adding smoothing, adding smoothing, adding smoothing. Because you really do want to make sure that your arms are not smooth to the point of being bubbly, but smooth so that they don't look like wet cloth, which can happen sometimes. And that's why using the inflate is quite nice, because it'll inflate smoothly like that. But if I was obviously trying to build that up through like the clay build-up, it might get a little bit lumpy. And sometimes I want that lumpiness. You know, sometimes it's nice to define muscle groups by doing that. So you can see every time you see it go in, I'm just holding the Alt tool on this on the inflate brush. We can see just paying attention to those muscle groups. We're able to get some halfway decent arms fairly quickly. And again, it's less is more with this. You know, you don't need necessarily to define every strand of at all. You don't need to define every strand of muscle, but what you do need to define is a clear shape of each suggested muscle. Because again, at this resolution, this whole thing is only 128.3. So we're only going to get so much information. I can come in here and start to over define some stuff to knock it back. So that pinpoint in the shoulder. Pinpoint the front of the shoulder there. Coming into the top of the shoulder there. Maybe my shoulder itself and the deltoid could be a little bit bigger, so I'll just get the inflate tool and just nudge it, and it is literally only little nudges. And I might even have to knock it back a little bit after that. Because see as well, I'm constantly moving around. Because one thing I'm also looking for, it's very easy to make everything look too bulgy and round. So I'm constantly looking forward, looking around the model, orbiting around, looking for parts of the body which are too round, too bulbousy. Then I could just help to define some bits of the muscle. A lot of it is just that suggestion of shadow as well. I don't need to define everything so much. I just need to suggest that stuff is happening. And then we as people will be like, okay, I get that. I understand what's going on there. So having a little bit of a decrease, having a little bit of a shadowing with those pectoral areas there helps it kind of sell that. Bringing in a little bit of a, that's a bit too much yourself. It's like a little bit of a separation between the lats and deltoid. It's a little bit there. And you'll often see me add these little lines, like something like this, and then just add them in, and just knock back that, sorry. What I'm really thinking about when I'm doing that is the overlapping of the muscles. So I'm not just doing it arbitrarily. There is a reason for me doing that. I'm thinking, okay, then there's going to be muscles folding over in certain parts. There's going to be reasons for it. Like I said, I'm not just doing it willy-nilly. And it's always just that very slight shadow you need to suggest something. A little bit so there is a little bit of a lump on my elbow there, which is a thing. If you're bony or athletic, you do have a little bit of a bump where your elbow bone kind of hits the surface. So mine's a little bit too big. Now I'm going to leave this sculpt here for now, because I could keep working this and keep working this for ages, and it ended up getting really messy again. But for now, I'm going to leave it like that. Because that's all it is. It's very, very simple. You bring it in separate objects for things like your arm, your forearm, either one big tube for the whole arm, or like I just did then, one for the forearm, one for the bicep. And then you will, all I'm doing is just matching the roundabout scale of what I want for my arm, be big or small. And then I'm just tracing in the muscles that I need to have in there. Obviously, if you're doing something like a giant, fat, like Warhammer monster kind of thing, you don't necessarily need that. You just need the mass, and then you might want to sculpt in like elbow or something like that. But generally, what we want to do at first is just think about those muscles. Think about those. If you get this in, think about those key shapes. Ignoring the hand and stuff. Think about those key shapes. And this as well. Really, really try and think about this. If it makes sense to you, if this doesn't make sense to you, don't worry about it. But this helped me immensely understand the way that muscles kind of like flow in and out of each other. So that ends the arm section. I'm going to do another video on legs. Legs are pretty similar. It's just the big thing about legs is where they connect to the body. That's the thing, how they make sense up here. Especially for more kind of athletic bodies, or as we're doing like our standard bodies. There's a couple of features I wanted to think about at the very, very beginning. But generally, it's as simple as the body. In fact, I prefer doing legs. I really, really like sculpting legs. So I'll end this one here because it's getting up to an hour now, and the next video is going to be the legs.